And we are joined now by Max Alvarez, who is editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. He is host of what is Working People, right, Max?
The Working People podcast.
Yeah, and is the author of the great book, The Work of Living, which is sort of like an update to Studs Terkel in a lot of ways in the modern economy. Great book, highly recommended. Nobody better here to talk about the ongoing negotiations between the railroad union and the railroad bosses. Joe Biden put the railroad workers in a bit of a bind about a week ago when he came out and said, we have a tentative deal and we have a great deal. Congratulations to everybody, which sort of says to everyone, we're done with this. It's over. Everybody move on. The media has mostly moved on.
It's the best deal. We have a great deal.
It's the best deal. It's a beautiful deal. I mean, I had a beautiful call with the railroad bosses. I told them, give them the best deal. And so the workers were saying, okay, well, what is the deal? Now details are starting to emerge from it. Max, what's in the deal? What did workers win, and what do workers feel like they still need to fight for?
Man, well, thanks for having me on, guys, and congratulations on the new show. Great to see you there.
Thank you.
Excited to have you on.
Yeah, no, I'm pumped. Even if I am very, very tired, but I'm glad that we're doing this segment, right? Because as you mentioned, last week was just yet another test case for how far we have to go to understand like labor struggles in this country, which our existing kind of corporate media ecosystem does not really help us to do. Like you mentioned, we were rapidly approaching the deadline last Friday, after which strikes initiated by the 12 unions representing railroad workers on the Class 1 freight railroads could begin, or lockouts could begin initiated by the rail carriers, the companies that own the railroads. So we were rapidly approaching that deadline, and in the hours before that deadline came, the announcement on Thursday of last week was that, the Biden administration, Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, the union presidents and the rail carriers had hammered out, a last-minute deal to avert a rail shutdown. The media, celebrated it like George W. Bush's mission accomplished speech.
Yes.
And everyone felt like, okay, well, the crisis averted, we can move on to the next thing. And yeah, like, no, that's not what's happening right now. In fact, like, there's a lot that people need to understand about what's going on here. Like, as I mentioned on many an interview and in the coverage we've been doing for the Real News Network, it took a long time for us to reach this point at which a national rail strike or a rail lockout could legally happen under the terms of the Railway Labor Act. All that momentum had built up, all that frustration and anger had built up, and we were a day away from that deadline. And at the very last second, that the balloon is popped. This deal that no one got to see for a number of days was reached, and the cooling off period was extended while the unions, eventually reviewed the terms of that tentative deal. And in fact, like, what was nuts was the people who were in that room who hammered out that deal said that they couldn't release the details for a few days because they were recovering from the marathon bargaining session, which is kind of tone deaf when we're talking about a workforce that is complaining about not having any time to spend with their families, being run into the ground by, their work schedules and draconian attendance policies. So that kind of didn't really land with a lot of the membership who were saying, well, we're tired. I'm sorry that you had to do your job, but like, what's in the actual deal? And so we've started to finally get the details of that deal. I can go on if you want, but I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
No, I actually want to keep pulling at that thread. Like, what is right now the sentiments among the workers and the union representatives who have been trying to hammer out this negotiation? Are they happy with the representation they have at the negotiating table? What is that dynamic like right now?
It's always hard to say in these situations because obviously the most disgruntled factions are going to inevitably be the loudest. And so, folks who've been covering this for a long time, like myself, Jonah Furman at Labor Notes, Mel Buer, who works with me at The Real News, and you folks over at Breaking Point in the Breaking Point studio, Crystal's covered this a lot. We're hearing a lot of dissatisfaction from the rank and file right now. right? And there are numerous reasons why people are pissed off about how this whole process has unfolded, and now they are also pissed off about the contents of the tentative agreement that was reached last week. But it also remains to be seen what the rest of the membership has to say, because frankly a lot of people are worn out by this process. A lot of people have kind of resigned themselves to the fact that nothing significant is going to change on the railroads, and the problems that have caused a real crisis in our supply chain by running the workers who make that supply chain move into the ground. A lot of folks have resigned themselves to the fact that they may just have to quit. This is not necessarily the career that they thought it was. So there is a lot of disgruntlement, and the workers may end up kind of voting these tentative agreements down. In which case, we'll be right back to where we were last week when a potential rail shutdown could happen. And I think that they have good reason to be disgruntled. I'm a side observer. Obviously, I wear my politics on my sleeve. I want workers to get a good contract. I want working people to get what they deserve and to stop being taken advantage of. But this is ultimately up to the membership, and they are the ones who are going to have the final say on whether or not to ratify this tentative agreement. And so far, 2 of the craft unions that out of the 12 that again represent over 100,000 workers on the Class 1 freight railroads. This is the Transportation Communications Union and the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen have so far voted to ratify the tentative agreement. However, the rail division of the Machinist Union rejected the tentative agreement and are back into bargaining at the moment. The big news that came, I think, just 48 hours ago is one of the 2 biggest unions representing workers on the railroads. That's the Transportation Division of the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers released the tentative agreement language to its members. They are current, and like the details that we have found in that tentative agreement are really nothing to write home about. I mean, essentially, it is, just a slightly nicer version of the PEB, Presidential Emergency Board recommendations that workers were prepared to reject and strike over last week, right? The only movement that has really happened on that front, which is kind of laughable, is that workers would now have 3 unpaid personal days per year for medical appointments. However, the catch is that those medical appointments need to be scheduled between Tuesday and Thursday at least 30 days ahead. So, if folks are going to get sick and need to go to the doctor, they need to be planning a month ahead for that. And the other one is that we've talked a lot about the draconian attendance policies and how workers have no paid sick days, and staff has been cut so deep on the railroads that there are no real reserve workers left, which is why workers are always on call and always working long, arduous hours and get penalized for taking any time off whatsoever. So the new, sweetener to this deal is that there will be no penalizations or penalties for workers who are hospitalized or like actively in surgery. And just think about how dystopian and Orwellian that sentence is. Like, oh, wow, we hammered out a great deal where you won't get fired for going into surgery. Like, thanks, I guess. But like the other thing that I would say, a lot of this is really in the weeds and would take more time to unpack. I've been talking to railroaders over the course of the week. But there are other things that were points of contention in the Presidential Emergency Board report that are cropping back up in this tentative agreement, because the PEB essentially kicked these issues down the road, or said, like, you guys have 60 more days to negotiate. Otherwise, you go into binding arbitration. And if you go into binding arbitration, the lawyers who oversee it are going to go with past precedent. So workers kind of see the writing on the wall when it comes to things that are very in the weeds but are actually very consequential for their lives, like what you'll hear this term self-supporting pools. And what that essentially means, right, is that you have workers, engineers who are assigned to trains, and if any one of those engineers, or conductors can't make that assignment, then there is a reserve pool of workers who will fill in that assignment. Essentially, what the self-supporting pool system, which is already implemented in 2 of the class freight railroads, means is it eliminates that reserve pool and makes it harder for people who are assigned to trains to actually take that time off. So it just accelerates this long-running trend that we've been seeing on the Class 1 freight railroads, where there were over 500,000 workers on these railroads railroads in 1980, over the course of the past 4 decades, that has been reduced to under 130,000. And since 2015 alone, the rail carriers have collectively eliminated over 30% of their workforce. So they've been slashing and burning, which is why workers have no reserves to pick up their shifts for them if they call out sick, which is why they're being run into the ground and why they're going to work sick and why they are unable to take the time off that they need. So a lot of the issues that workers are ready to strike over because the PEB recommendations fell so short are still here in this tentative agreement. So it is very possible that we didn't avert a strike, we just delayed one.
And your point about how hard it is to know how the full membership is feeling is a really good one and an important one to remember. And it's something you pick up covering strike negotiation after strike negotiation, because as you say, the most militant workers also happen to be the ones that are most likely to be talking to reporters. And so, you're not a militant worker worth your salt if you don't trash whatever deal is made, like as soon as it's struck. And so, you're right that when you first start coming, you say, oh, well, the workers I'm hearing from absolutely hate this deal. This thing's going down. And then you see it get ratified by 70 or 80%. You're like, well, what happened here? So I think you're very right to say that we don't know. Now the union is arguing that these moves in the direction that you talked about, these modest, kind of almost laughable moves, are actually significant because they set a precedent. Like that the companies had resisted negotiating over days off forever. Like that was a red line for them. Like that's up to us. You cannot negotiate over sick days, and so breaking that red line and getting this concession around hospitalization, which maybe you could tweak to tweak internally to say that's urgent care. So if you go to CVS, that counts. So you can't fire me because look, here's my receipt. I went down to urgent care at CVS. That the union is saying this is a great step forward because we broke their will on this question of whether we can negotiate around this. So let's ratify this contract, and then when the next contract comes up, now these things are on the table, and we can negotiate around them. Also, a lot of money was thrown at workers, because that's how much they care about this corporate strategy of stripping the workforce to the bone. They'd rather give raises and give ratification bonuses than actually negotiate around time off. So what do you think of the union's argument to its members that by setting this precedent that it's a significant enough victory that it ought to be ratified?
So it's a great point and an important one for folks to consider, right? Because it is significant that the rail carriers actually budged even a centimeter on bargaining over scheduling and attendance policies, right? Because that has really been the core of the the stalled negotiations that have been going on for 2.5 years. And speaking of which, that's another point that is important to note is I think what a lot of rail workers would say, and what a lot of them have been telling me, is that there is a significant difference between what is written on paper and what happens in practice with these policies, right? So the wage increase, it's the deal that was reached is being hailed as a historic wage increase for workers on the railroads, a 24% increase compounded from now till 2024, including yearly bonuses. When you average in inflation and stuff like that, and you factor in the fact that the unions have had essentially a stalled, nullified contract and have been working without an updated contract for like 2 to 3 years, right? That is the last period at which the wage increase counted. So they've been going without those for these past couple of years. So that kind of makes the numbers seem a little bit bigger. Again, this is kind of in the weeds. But the thing that I would really kind of say from what I'm hearing from workers is that yes, the precedent is important, but the crisis is here, and this is really like throwing a pebble at a tank, because the past precedents that were set that allowed the rail carriers to continue forward with this cost cutting, profit maximizing, service diminishing, a policy that has taken root across the Class 1 freight railroads. This has already ruined, the supply chain. It's already ruined, the job itself, to the point that workers are already quitting in record numbers, because what rail carriers say on paper often doesn't translate to what workers experience in practice. I'll give you one example. In the current tentative agreement, this is, again, very much in the weeds, but there's something you may hear workers bring up, which is the automated bid scheduling system. This is a system by which, workers submit their requests for days off. Seniority plays a factor into it. Again, I won't go into the details, but essentially one of the examples that was given to me is that when you utilize this system and, you sort of choose which, lines you're going to run, when you're going to be able to take your, vacation or days off, what may happen is, like, your vacation may be set to start on a Saturday, but you get called in for a job on a Friday and you don't get back home until like late Sunday. That doesn't push your vacation time back. That counts like in your vacation time. And so, it's because of the frantic scheduling, the unpredictable scheduling, and all the delays and so on and so forth, that you may not actually get what, the contract says, and you may lose out on vacation time. You may not get approved time off, even if you submitted the request. So as Ron Kamenko of Railroad Workers United loves to say, the devil is really in the details. And there are a lot of details to go over here, and that's exactly what the rank and file is going to be doing over the course of the next couple weeks.
Yeah, and Max, what is the timeline that we're looking at?
So this is kind of, again, where it gets hairy, is there are multiple overlapping timelines right now. So the SMART TD tentative agreement, again, this is one of the, two largest unions representing workers on the freight railroads. So they have a timeline right now of sort of reviewing the tentative agreement. They will be able to kind of submit formal questions to the rail carriers in a couple of weeks. And the voting process for the membership is expected to take place over the course of a few weeks, beginning later this month. However, as I said, we already have two of the craft unions that have voted to ratify, but the machinists have voted not to ratify. And so that kicks the timeline for I think the machinists are currently have the next timeline to ratify coming up. And if they decide to reject it, that could trigger a national rail shutdown, because that's kind of what happened in 1992. It wasn't all the unions that went on strike. In fact, it was one carrier who initiated lockouts. And so the rest of the unions, couldn't, cross picket lines and couldn't get into their terminals. And so that triggered a, railroad-wide shutdown, even though it was initiated by one carrier. This could happen this time around, where if one union rejects the contract, the tentative agreement, and decides to go on strike, that will effectively trigger a railroad-wide strike, because the other unions have clauses in their contract that say they will not cross a picket line if they feel it's hazardous to them. So you could, in effect, have, a national rail shutdown if one union votes to go on strike right now. So the next month or two is going to be very interesting.
Right.
Well, Max, thank you so much for the update. And again, Max's book, The Work of Living, very much worth watching. Max Alvarez, editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
It's so interesting because the media really just wanted to move on, right? The deal was reached, and they just this week ducked out.
We're good with this. Yeah.
Washed our hands of it. The Biden administration's good with it. We're good with it.
Yeah. And it may work out. We'll see. But we don't know.
They also only jumped in when the deadline was like set into a crunch time. And it's one of the ways that like people on the left will sometimes complain about the media being right wing, and the point is generally taken on foreign policy, but it's also taken on labor issues.
Right. And I will say, to see President Biden come in on the side of railroad workers, like if you know the history of the railroads and particularly Democratic presidents, they're much more likely to send in the National Guard or the Army to break railroad strikes and kill workers than to call up and yell at railroad bosses. So that was fun to see.
It's a new era.
It is a new era. All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. As always, Brian Grimm, DC Bureau Chief over at The Intercept, my newsletter Bad News over at Substack. You can check that out.
You're a Substacker.
Yeah. Well, I was a proto-Substacker.
Oh, gee.
I started the newsletter in like 2014, 2015.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long time.
Before Substack came around in 2017, and I used to pay
to host
every month, to send the newsletter out. And then Substack comes around, they're like, you can use this for free. I'm like, Okay.
Sounds good to me.
That beats paying.
Yeah.
So I've been actually I've had it over at Substack for like 5 years now.
Yeah, check out Bad News over at Substack. You can check out Federalist Radio Hour, where I am every day. We're so grateful to everybody for
When is that?
every day.
Like when's it on? Or is it just?
It's just uploaded Monday through Friday. 5 days a week. A daily podcast is a lot of work, as Sagar and Crystal know, and it's we
I hear radio and I think that it's a time, but no,
it's just the name. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it is like booking a guest every day is a whole thing. But anyway, and you can see some of I'll have some of the people we talk to here at CounterPoints on the show to sort of even go into more depth. So that's always fun. But really, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Make sure you're liking and subscribing everywhere you download your podcasts, over on YouTube. We really appreciate it. We're having so much fun here.
Good time.
It's a blast.
Good
we're
time.
we're so thankful to Sagar and Crystal for letting us have these chairs on Fridays.
That's right.
We should mess something up in the studio, just like start
That's right.
changing small things over time.
That's a good idea. Let's do it.
Just start leaving joints in Sagar's chair.
Call the cops on him. Everybody have a great weekend. Don't do anything Sagar wouldn't do.
See you next week.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.